Hello everyone, it is Tuesday. We do an API review, and if you're watching this live, you are doing it wrong because right now there's .NET Conf. You should check .NET Conf out instead because there's interesting sessions here. You can always watch the recording of this one later, but if you really insist, you don't want to watch .NET Conf, then be my guest. But don't tell us we didn't tell you that there's .NET Conf going on. All right, so I think we can get started with this one here, right? Oh, great.
same, except it'd be exactly the same, except instead of having the generic create method, we would have two create overloads, non-generic, one that took a read-only span byte and one that took a read-only span char.
Okay, so not that you would make like constructors or so, just sticking with the create pattern, just degenerifying it.
Right.
That's fair. So the question that I have for this is system the right namespace for the, or I guess two questions. Is system the right namespace for the type, and do we need or want it to be specific to index of any, or is there a more general set that comes out of this? If this is supposed to be we know you're using it for index of any, so we can do all the work and create and pick an optimization, and index of any down here that we're adding is actually just going to call an instance method in this guy, then, we need the type and it's specialized and etc. But these are the questions I wanted to ask.
So namespace, I don't have a strong opinion. If you want to use one of these and it's not in system, you'll have to import an additional namespace. I don't think that's a big deal, just calling it out. The initial proposal actually had them as nested types inside of memory extensions. We could put it inside of some system dot buffers or system
if
dot
data
memory
didn't mean SQL, then data would be the place I would think of, but it does mean SQL. So
it could, we could put it wherever. In terms of the name of the type, the only other, Miha had brought up the possible issue that in the future maybe we would want contains, which is basically index of greater than or equal to 0. And if we did that, would we have a contains overload that took an index of any values, and would that naming disparity be strange? And we agreed it would be a little strange, but we also couldn't come up with anything better. If you have suggestions for what the type should be called, don't have a strong, like my affinity is to the capability provided here, not to the names. With the one exception that I really like, and I know others may disagree with me, but I really like that these methods on memory extensions are just overloads of the existing methods, because it basically highlights you either pass in the data or you passed in a cached version of the data. Either way, you're calling the same method.
Would it be reasonable to offer the same stuff on string directly?
We could. We could.
Because
presumably there's no
the extension
really
methods won't show up on string as presented here.
Yeah.
I mean, we already don't have a bunch of these memory extensions APIs on string. Like, there's an index. The memory extensions that index of any takes 1, 2, or 3 values or a span. None of which, like the 2 for index of any, rather 2, 3, or a span. The 2, 3, and span things don't show up on string already. It only has the index of for a single value, and then index of any that takes, I think it's a char array.
Yeah, on string you also have globalization concerns, which putting these on memory extensions is actually rather nice, because you can say, oh, because they're generic, like we don't have to deal with any of the compare info, things like that.
I mean,
that's a good point. They also pick up the existing semantics of everything else they're consistent with on memory extensions, which is we're dealing with spans, we're dealing with ordinal. Whereas index of on string, well, I guess for char it's still ordinal. For string, it's culture sensitive, right?
Yeah, and to be fair, like string.index of any is ordinal as well, but there are other weird considerations there that might not make it an exact one-to-one mapping.
Yeah, so I mean, ignoring how it's potentially implemented, it sounds like it's really just set of T, and so it's what's the distinction of this type from set of T. And if it really is that, well, the whole purpose of this type is the create method picks a good implementation of how we can do index of based on the input set, rather like the frozen collections we just added, and that this is really for index of or anything else that is like index of, where contains is index of not equal -1. And then it's like, okay, that's why it's different than set of t, and sure.
It's basically transforming the data into a format that will make the search efficient. It may not even be storing the original values. Well, I guess it probably is storing the original values, but it's probably storing stuff in addition to the original values.
Yeah, actually, along those lines, it looks like this type is meant to be completely opaque. Like you can't write your own extension method outside of the BCL, which consumes this, correct? Because there's no way to crack it open.
Right. We could, in the future, we could consider an extensibility model, but I don't think the extensibility model would almost certainly be abstract methods on index of any values of t that map to the 4 exact overloads on memory extensions, because most likely what's going to happen is these 4 methods on memory extensions are just going to delegate to some internal abstract methods on index of any values. At which point is from an extensibility point of view, is it really adding value, since someone could just call those methods directly on someone's implementation?
Right. Yeah, so I think the scenario here makes total sense, and I don't have any real feedback on the API surface other than like index of any value should probably be sealed, but whatever. Because there's no constructor on it, right?
No public constructor.
Right. Oh, are you suggesting that we might create an internal subclass?
We will create internal subclasses.
Oh, okay.
If we don't, we will need to do additional work in the JIT. So the primary consumption model is what's highlighted at the bottom of the screen, where, like, for example, the HTTP rule parser API,
okay,
where you're just caching this thing into a static read-only. And if you do this, the JIT is very good today at devirtualizing. So any virtual methods we have on here will be devirtualized in this pattern. If index of any values is sealed and instead wraps something else or delegates in some other fashion, the JIT won't be able to do as good a job without additional work today.
Okay, got
it. So what is is there really nothing we can expose from index of any values that is meaningful?
You could be enumerable over t, but
yeah.
So you could get the t back, or you could get the values back.
You could make it possible to get the values out if you wanted to.
But then that would, expose that it's a set and lossy.
I mean, I'm mostly thinking from a debugger standpoint, right? Like if I'm looking at an instance of this in the debugger, can I actually see anything useful? Like
oh, well, we can do whatever we want from a debugger perspective. We could slap a debugger display and a debugger type proxy onto this thing if we wanted to.
Yeah, I would just make sure that you can at least see the values that you constructed it from, right? That would be like massively useful.
I mean, that certainly works while t is byte and char. It gets. I mean, we can use built-in deferred string formatting, but can the debugger display call another debugger display?
You can use a proxy type like Steve just mentioned. So you can say, for the purposes of debugging, this is an IEnumerable, and have the debugger enumerate it.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I'd also be fine if we really think this is important. We could make this an IEnumerable of t.
Yeah, I care less about that. It's like, I mean, it could be a property, it could be debugger display, but it doesn't really matter. Like, it's just. Like most of the time, I think you care about, like, is this empty, or does it have like the 4 values I passed in, right? Or does it have like 2 specialized things? Like, just being able to quickly look at it, what it is that you're standing on, I think is massive.
I mean, if you're in the debugger and you have the instance, then you'd see that the index of any values that you got back is actually index of range, or whatever specialized implementation Steve throws back out of create.
Yeah, and I like this because it's a minimum viable product from an API surface perspective, and all of the value add we can do under the covers.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, like, it seems like based on the naming, you really think these types are tied to that operation, right? You don't think there's going to be any reuse. Is that fair?
I'm not creative enough at the moment to think of anything outside of index of any and contains. I won't swear that there's nothing else in the future, but I'm having trouble thinking of anything.
Yeah, and personally, I'm okay with a contains method taking an index of any values, because they're close enough where the naming doesn't bother me all that much.
Yeah, mostly just like, I mean, it depends on how you want to name this, right? Like you can either name it as the thing that it represents, and I don't know what the data structure is. You said Bloom filter, that's probably like super specialized, but I don't know, logically like a character set or something to that extent, right? And then if you want to use other methods, then it's pretty straightforward to do that. If you name it index of any, it's a bit weird if that's, because it kind of like, it doesn't really tell you what it is, it just tells you how to use it, which is not the same thing. So it kind of depends on where the future is. If it's always going to be just an argument for index of any, the name is probably fine. But yeah, I guess any better name might be too nice, right? That's the other concern I would have. Like, you know, character set might be too good of a name, or value set too generic of a name, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally fine here with an obscure name and an obscure namespace, as long as the pattern exists and it's an overload of the existing methods.
Exactly.
Other than that, my care factor is very low.
Yeah. Why is it I equatable of T?
T is
No,
not.
sorry,
T
it's
is.
not. That's aware. Never mind. I can read.
You say that, but provide evidence to the contrary.
I was reading in German. The thing at the last was supposed to go second. It's just.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, so I mean, are we okay with system.buffers for the types, and then memory extensions obviously lives in system already, so we leave it there.
I'm good with that, given that like we expect people to really use static read only for these things. So you import the namespace, declare it once, and then you just keep calling the extension method over and over and over again.
On the one hand, it feels like clutter in the system namespace. On the other hand, I cannot think of a better place to put it. So if memory extensions was in a different namespace, then I would say it should flow with that, but it's.
But
like,
what's wrong with having the types in system.buffers?
I mean, we can, if you think that makes sense.
I mean, to me, they're not really any different from, let's say, span action, right? There's overloads that take that exists in the system namespace, like I think the string one of the string constructors, I think, takes a span action, right? So, I mean, it is more of an advanced thing. And I mean, I think system buffers is kind of the home for these utilitarian types.
I thought span action was in system.
No, it's in system buffers.
If we want to keep system less cluttered, I think system buffers is fine.
Yeah. Because, I mean, as long as you just, I mean, to Stephen's point, right, the real value of having them as overloads is you can discover them, right? And then, you know, as you're completing it, like, it will do the right thing. So I don't think it's bad to have it there. But I have a hard time seeing this is, I mean, if we don't want to have them on overloads on string because we think of this as a more, you know, high performance scenario, I think it's fine to say, you know, you use it when you use it. And until then, we don't have to promote it overly.
It's fair. Yeah. System.buffers looks okay to me.
And then we still have the open question of whether we want the create method to be generic or to have two that are specific to byte and char, which are all we plan to optimize right now.
So what happens?
I'd make them specific until we have a reason to make it generic.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's a downside from an API standpoint, right? It just.
Well, if we thought we were going to make them generic in this release, or we thought we were going to make it generic in the next release, and we didn't see value in still having the non-generic versions, then we can eliminate two method defs. But I think that even if we added it, I think at this point, based on the description of where the linker and stuff are, we would end up even unnecessarily overloading them just so the linker had better targets. So I would leave the T out until we have a reason to add it.
Right. My point
Sounds
is just
fine.
if we make it generic later, it doesn't really change anything. It just means you have two methods that are more specific, right? And if you really wanted to, we can put editor browsable on it, so you don't even see it. So I mean, there's not really a massive downside to that pattern.
Right. It's like 60 bytes in the redist.
Yeah, I mean, if we still do it because it's like, similar to the params overloads where we have specialized ones just to make the product slightly more efficient, I think that's fine too.
Yep.
At that point, you just trade. So then we would just call them create, right? same name and then just rely on overloading for the argument. And it would be byte and char. Is that fine?
Yep.
Yeah, it seems reasonable.
So that would look like this then.
Miha, are you good with all this?
Yeah, this sounds great. I had one question about the index of values. I'm not sure it matters much, but should it be abstract or not? You can't implement it either way from outside WCL.
I would say that that's an implementation detail of whatever you find most useful.
Yeah, I don't think, like, if you declare something abstract in it, then obviously you have to mark it as abstract because of language rules. But I don't think there's a reason we would need to say it's abstract in the ref if, like, unless, you know, we feel like it. Emo, the overloaded creates don't get generic constraints because they're not generic.
So what are you talking about?
You called it
Delete the
index
where
of,
t from.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. By the way, what does it mean to have the question mark at the end?
That means that the t can be nullable.
But wouldn't that be at the argument of I equatable?
No, if you had just where t : I equatable t, then you would get a warning if you tried to instantiate the t with a, like, say, string question mark.
Yeah, what I meant is, shouldn't be the question mark in the brackets?
No, it's not the t, it's the I equatable of t.
You can implement an interface as a nullable version of itself. I don't even know what that means. I think maybe I need coffee.
Is it because of things like string, which are themselves potentially nullable reference types?
Right.
Okay, got it.
Like, you can, like, there's a difference between string and string question mark. So if this was where t : I equatable of t, and you tried to create with a string question mark, you'd get a warning. And you won't get a warning if it's where t : I equatable t question mark, because you're basically saying the t can be a nullable type.
Oh, because the question mark doesn't translate to the argument, so it doesn't become I equatable of t question mark. It just becomes I equatable of t question mark.
Whatever the t is, it's
Yeah.
an I equatable of that. So if the
Yeah.
t is a string question mark, then it's an I equatable of string question mark.
Yeah.
But you can't say that if you haven't allowed the I equatable itself to be a nullable type.
Yeah, type systems are fun.
Because string question mark is not a guaranteed not null I equatable.
Right.
And I guess the reference assembly should have the internal constructor in it, so no one can create it, but whatever,
Yeah.
we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Either internal or private protected or whatever we put in our refs.
Yeah, the ref generator will do the right thing.
Oh, neat, okay.
Actually, it won't because it's in too low of a level and you have to edit the ref by hand, but we should make sure we get that right in the ref.
Yeah.
At least I don't think we have system and system buffers. I don't think they get to do auto-generated ref CSs because they're really in core lib and that's split across multiple reference assemblies.
Right. Oh, should we also put a note in the comments here of what we talked about debugging, making it easier for people to inspect, just so it's officially captured?
Yeah, I'm writing.
Because I think that was a really good point that was brought up.
Okay, so here are my notes. Anything missing?
Neat.
I take it that means ship it.
Mach 2s.
Alrighty.
That doesn't make any sense.
Next one.
All right, so This one's been out for a while. Basically, we've started this pattern of adding these throw helpers where they're really common to some of our core exception types, mainly argument exceptions. We have argument null exception, throw if null, argument exception, throw if null or empty. We've got object disposed exception, throw if. The next big category is around argument out of range. And so Heuristic, I'm assuming that's how he pronounces his alias, basically scoured through all of .NET Runtime looking for the most common patterns around our argument out of range exceptions, and this is what they came up with. It's fairly straightforward. It's using the new generic math stuff, so that it's not just specific to just int or something. It'll work with any type that are the appropriate iNumber base for the top few, and the rest of them are just iComparables. Follows the same caller argument expression pattern, so you don't have to actually specify the name of the parameter.
Tanner, can you remind me the difference between iNumber base and iNumber? Because when we proposed it, the idea was no one should ever see the base type.
iNumber base includes support for things like complex numbers, whereas iNumber is what most people consider to be regular numbers, so real numbers and things like that, mathematically speaking.
So do we feel like we have an internal policy of we shouldn't take iNumber base here, or should we take it because we can?
We should probably take it because we can, and most of the APIs for checking things like 0, negative, etc. are on iNumber base.
Yeah, I mean, I assume that they had been implemented and
yeah,
the interface was verified, but it's like when I did a talk that talked about generic math, I pretended iNumber base didn't exist and only talked about iNumber, and so I'm just...
I think that's fine. I mean, that's a typical difference between the implementer and the user, right? I mean, users usually use list of t, right? But then we have I-read-only list and I-list of t and blah, 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 right? So I think it's the same here. Like, for the most part, I don't think people actually care about what the signature says. They will try to instantiate it, and the compiler will tell them whether they got it right or not, right?
That's fair. Just, I didn't know if that was one of those, we were adding it for when people really, really cared and we were going to otherwise pretend it didn't exist, or
yeah,
if it was if somebody's declaring a type of their own, that they can think of the constraints of iNumber and ignore the complexity of iNumber base. But
yeah, I will say I don't think we need the struct constraint. Users can fully implement number types for on classes, and I don't think we need iComparable here. So a comparable number, so when you've got iNumber base plus iComparable, then you're basically saying iNumber. Because the only reason iNumber base doesn't implement iComparable is because things like complex numbers can't be compared. But also, you can do a check for, we actually just have, if you have t where t is iNumber base, then you can just do t is 0 and t is negative and t is negative or t is 0. So I don't think we really need the iSign number or the iComparable restrictions there.
So you're suggesting for the first three overloads, for all the overloads for all the methods on the screen, you're saying remove the struct constraint. For the first three methods, you're saying remove iComparable?
Remove everything except for iNumber base.
Why just...
Because is negative is on iNumber base.
What? I guess I'm confused why we wouldn't want iSign number if it's about checking for negative.
So this is the same thing about how you wanted to remove the struct constraint from vector 128 of t.
Yeah, and you told me no.
Right, I told you no because of JIT limitations, and then I retconned that into maybe we should look and see if those JIT limitations were lifted, and we can lift that. But basically the premise is if you have a t, you might not have constrained it to be positive or negative, or you might not have constrained it to be signed specifically, and you still want to say like if this happened to be a signed number and it was negative, throw. Otherwise, if it's a positive, just treat this as an OOP and drop it as dead code.
So iNumber base has an is negative
Yes.
property or member, whatever.
Yep.
Okay. That seems reasonable. So basically, the first three are left purely with where t : iNumber base of t.
Yes.
And we don't. Do we want to allow t to be nullable? Is there any scenario where that would make sense? Probably not, right?
I mean, the C# rules are nullable is not anything, right? So if 0, well, it's not 0. Like if you say not equal 0, that's false. If you say equal 0, it's also false. So I don't think we can answer the question if any of them are null. So we shouldn't allow null.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
Then where t : iNumber base of t.
Yeah, in particular, I would expect someone to have throw if null value, and then after that, they would do the check of throw if 0.
Right. I mean, obviously, it's only relevant for reference types too, which is probably the vast minority case.
Yeah.
Right. But the value or the method on iNumber base is static, so we'd be calling t dot is negative. So if they make a thing that says it's iNumber base supporting nullable t, then great, they can declare whether null is negative or not in their own implementation.
And then Tanner, for the other 5 methods, you were saying just remove the struct constraint, right?
Yeah, because you can have comparable classes. There's no reason why you wouldn't want to allow throw if some reference type was greater than.
That's fair. The other thing we were having trouble with, and sorry, not to cut you off, Jeremy. The other thing we're having trouble with was the naming of the arguments in throw if not between. This was the best. The original proposal had left and right, which I didn't love. I suggested inclusive lower and inclusive upper, but that would make, I think, a lot of sense if it was throw if between. I think that's pretty clear. Because it's throw if not between, it's a little confusing whether the inclusive is about the range that's being included or the range that's being excluded.
So I would say inclusive would be throw if not between with inclusive would be if value is less than or I guess it's greater than lower and less than upper. Whereas if it was exclusive, it would be less than or equal to and greater than or equal to.
Right. The intended semantics here are throw if value is less than lower or greater than upper.
Right.
So we need a name that maps to that.
Throw if outside. I think there's nothing you can do in the naming to really say inclusive or exclusive for the boundaries, but I mean, I think the parameter names will do that, right?
I'm sorry, but what were you suggesting?
Throw if outside. Because none of the other ones are negative, right? All the other ones are describing the condition under which you throw. Right? It's not like throw if not greater, right? It's saying throw if less than or equal to.
And outside is clear because 5 is not outside 5 and 7.
So in my personal project, I call this API throw if not in bounds, because that is the most common use case for it is a bounds check, and you're checking the bounds of the range effectively.
Right, but inside and outside are both bounds as words, and
yeah, but
they both tell you whether the goalpost is inclusive or exclusive. Between and in range leave the question the parameter names tell you, but I sort of agree with Emo's throw if outside. Why are you whining?
Yeah, I'm not sure I like the concept of inside and outside though.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Tanner. Do we have any other API that has outside in the name? Like we have an API. We in fact added one in .NET 7. Char dot is between. So we have between that shows up. We have range show up. So it's like throw if not in range, throw if not in bounds. Those personally sound better to me than throw if outside.
And If you look at how this API is going to be used most commonly, I expect that people are going to write throw if not between some value, comma 1, comma 100. And the call site's going to be very obvious as to what was meant. So I don't know if there's huge potential for confusion here.
Yeah, so I guess one question is, what's the intent? So if you have like a collection, do we expect that somebody should be able to pass in, something and something dot length, or do they need to do something dot length -1?
Well, that was actually the next thing I was going to ask. Like, this API probably should not fail if lower is greater than upper, because otherwise Jeremy's scenario would fall down when you're talking about empty lists.
Yeah, I don't think we do argument validation on the lower and upper's relationship to each other.
Okay. Because then at that point, someone could say throw if not between, my value, comma 0, comma list.length -1. And if it passes, you know that that indexer is valid.
Right. And I think it's, I know that in somewhere in the discussion there was a thing about enum, where there's actually a thing in FDG that specifically says do not use enum.isDefined for argument validation. But the throw if not between, or whatever we call it, lowest valid enum value, highest valid enum value makes sense. You can't really give a plus, like the +1 -1 gets weird on that one if it's not, these are the two literals that are the lowest and highest valid value. It's just making sure that we consider, collection count patterns. And if we say that you should pass count -1, then that's fine. That's the pattern. So.
Yeah, I mean, unless we were to make it inclusive, exclusive,
right?
You're gonna have to do something with the collection stuff. And I think inclusive, exclusive for this kind of scenario in general is confusing.
Should we have an overload that is in base that just takes a range?
We've hesitated using range for this before because ranges are always ranges only mean something with regard to a collection.
If they give a hat where we won't know how to rate the from the right, then we'd have to throw of I'm sorry, hats are not supported.
Yeah, it's more like the typical thing of if I think what would be unfortunate if people who have to call the APIs have to do math, right? Because then you have the kind of problem, right? So the most common thing you have is a start point and a length. Then taking an inclusive upper is unfortunate. And the benefit with range is you get to control how to construct it, right? So you can construct it from start and length, and you can construct it from 2 points, right? Based on the factory methods that we have, or the static factory methods, right? I mean, it's less about the syntax, it's more about similar to time span, where you can say, from seconds or from milliseconds, you avoid the whole ambiguity of what the value means, right?
Does that mean potentially that we should have a separate overload that works specifically with collections? So throw if out of bounds, T index, and then I collection of whatever, like the collection you're trying to index into.
I mean, that seems totally fair, and then it can do the -1 for you.
Yeah.
I think that would be good, actually. Yeah. I mean, because taking two values, it is unfortunate, right? Because two values could either be boundaries or start plus length, right? And we have both patterns in the BCL, unfortunately.
Well, so for throw if not between is basically just going to do, it's going to have to do less than or greater than. It's not going to be able to really optimize your special case without adding a bunch of ifs and type specializations. So
right.
Maybe we should just tell users to do those two checks and write their own small helper if they really need it. And look maybe at providing more concrete cases for the things like collections, where we clearly know they're wanting to do things like bounds checking. Then we could have throw if not in bounds and throw if not in insert bounds. And the difference between those is one considers length inclusive and one considers it exclusive, because if you're inserting, then things like list of T and other APIs accept length as a valid index, whereas if you're just indexing, then the length is exclusive. And those provide very clear names that make sense for the common use case of I'm dealing with a collection, and so therefore I want to check both lower and upper. And then we could also make it efficient with concepts of range and indexes and anything else if we really wanted.
Yeah.
I don't have a huge, I don't have a strong opinion, but there is something, I mean, it's such a common thing. It feels a little unfortunate that we'd force you to write throw if less than and then throw if greater than as separate things.
Is it common outside of collection types?
I mean, you could say that there are scenarios like choose a die face. You know, the answers that you can type in are 1 through 6. That's not really a collection. It's just, you know, dice are 6-sided. Well, maybe not the dice that you're used to, but yes.
I was about to say some Dungeons and Dragons person
Yeah.
just died.
Yeah. Sorry.
This is an easy case where you take an unsigned integer and then you restrict it to less than upper limit -1.
Obviously.
So if less than 6, then you know you've got a D5, or you've got a D6 within range, because 0 to 5 is 6 numbers.
But that's a good question. That's another thing I had. Like, should we have an optimized overload that just takes ins and then does that trick?
I mean, we could do that within the implementation, couldn't we?
So we already do the optimized tricks in like the is 0, is negative, and is negative or 0 checks. We already do that in iNumber base. So it would only be something for not between.
Gotcha.
So I'm just scanning. Most of the comparisons that I see are basically doing is this a valid index check. There's a hexadecimal character check, but it's more complicated than this can express because it's 2 discontiguous ranges.
I mean, we could have something like throw if index invalid, right? And then this one we could say effectively.
Yeah, so I mean,
start at
Tanner's point about, you know, insert, we could have, you know, throw if invalid index and throw if invalid insertion index. And if we wanted to have both of them, and then it would take index and the I
collection.
something.
Probably just I collection.
I was gonna say I read only collection, but then we have the good old I collection is not an I read only collection problem.
We could overload on those if we really wanted to too.
But then you can't pass collections in.
Oh, because
I mean, we could
now it's
overload on
ambiguous.
we could overload on collection, I collection, and I read only collection.
Sure.
And you're probably gonna hit the collection one.
Like, I guess the other problem too is like if we take I collection, whatever is the most basic, like, can we actually do the optimal not virtual dispatch within the implementation if we know that someone passed in a list of T's, say?
We don't do specialization for reference types, and so it would be dependent on inlining happening and there being a concrete type available for so that the JIT could devirtualize.
Sure, so that means list of T would be dead then.
I mean, we could overload anything we want to for if we think that the cost of the method is worth the value it provides.
Yeah, but now we run into weirdness where if you want to pass in a list of T specifically, well, that T is going to be different than the, I guess you would take int value instead of T value at that point. So, okay, so the compiler can do a generic inference at that point.
Right, well, it'd be like overloading on I collection of T and on list of T. And then it'd be like, oh, you're a list. I know I can call list of T. And then it would be the exact same code, but the count would be list of T's count instead of the interface's count.
Yeah.
Blurg.
It almost seems like we should have a
we could if
BCL
we
type
wanted.
for this. Similar to time span. That would solve all that problem.
Well, are we happy with the first, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 APIs?
It sounds like the first 7 are fine.
I mean, the stats on throwif0 says if it was the only thing being proposed, we would say no. But if we want to put it in for just squaring the circle, then I don't care.
Really,
Well,
is 0 that?
To keep in mind that we're only looking at the stats within the BCL. When like I've got a throwif0 helper in my utility library, I know that the Windows or the .NET Community Toolkit has a similar helper in their utility library. It's definitely common enough across the ecosystem to warrant it, I think.
Yeah,
I'm genuinely curious. What's a thing where 0 is a thing that you would call it as a special exception?
You're taking in an unsigned value, and for example, size of a window, of a texture, of your pixel depth. You know,
Okay,
you can't have 0 sizes once you start getting into UI. You have hidden and you've got properly sized.
Fair enough.
Or even for us, like console, if you try and set the window size, the width or height to 0, that throws.
Okay.
Yeah,
I guess it's
I was about to
the
say
same
like
as
0
anywhere that you would
seems-
throw if not positive. So
I guess it depends
where
on the
if you're
definition of
unsigned, then
positive.
0 is the only non-positive number you would have.
But we can't call it throw if not positive because 0 is considered positive by many APIs.
Yeah, but not by any mathematicians.
Yeah, but this is programming. Math doesn't count.
So just to clarify, like throw if negative, if t is say uint, is just a no op, right? Like it just gets elided completely.
Right.
Okay.
It's all of the primitives currently treated as just constant return false, and so the JIT will have to do some minimal inlining, but that's a really trivial thing for it to do.
And then
And
maybe we'll
since
figure out. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and since it's just 1 byte of 1 or 2 bytes of IL, it will be under the always inline limit.
Mhm. Okay. And then maybe
think-
we just figure out collections separately.
I think Emo or Jeremy, whoever just pasted this in, I think Tanner's suggestion from the first 3 APIs was to remove both I-signed number and I-comparable.
Yeah,
Oh, I missed
yeah,
that.
we shouldn't need those because we've got the relevant APIs directly on the type.
Okay.
Yeah, I did finally find some comparisons that are an in-range check that aren't bounded by 0. And that's at least like XML schema has some checks of the value you gave in. You told me we were going to convert it to a short, but you're less than short.min value or greater than short.max value. But the extremely vast majority of the range checks look like they're all anchored at 0, which basically makes them is invalid index or is invalid insertion index.
So everything cool with this proposal as it's on the screen right now?
I think this looks fine for the throw if not between. Is it we're going to revisit it or we're just saying no, never?
I think it's more like how would we solve this? So I was kind of serious. I think we should maybe reconsider having a BCL type for an index that is basically guaranteed to be bound rather than the index in range that we currently have. And then maybe have some sensible helpers on that, like, from start end and then from start length, for example. And then you can have a fairly trivial API for these things. Because going with collections seems bad for virtualization if you take interfaces and then you would have to decide which one to overload by, and then that might be result in ambiguities. And so I think it just comes down to let's revisit this once we have a proposal for how we express the API. I agree with you that it's common enough that we should have a helper method that is a one-liner rather than asking people to write like 3 or 4 individual checks themselves.
I pasted a link to my utilities class in chat. That's the throw if helpers that I've got, and the .NET Community Toolkit has a similar list.
Because yeah, I mean, according to the stats that are included in the issue, not between is the second most popular call off of the proposed list. Like, it's kind of the negative is the top hit, then not between is the next one. So it sort of feels like we should solve it, but if we want to solve it by saying it goes back to committee, I guess that's fine.
The thing that I was most interested in for it was specifically whether it was general purpose between checks or collection related, because I imagine that they're very much related but different concepts. And if the most common case is doing collection bound checks, then that might be easier to expose as a different API than just throw if not between.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think if you do collections, I think the most common one you want is like, basically the 0 is the start value and then length, right? But then I think you don't want the case where you take the I collection because of the disjointedness that we have in the BCL, and we can't provide overloads probably without making the call set ambiguous.
I mean, with BCL types, I think if we took I collection, I read only collection, and collection, I think that would make nothing in the BCL ambiguous, and I assume it would be.
I don't think it would compile if you pass in a list
of
of T at that point, because it's
collection.
No, it's all three of them, right? It's convertible to I read only list. It's convertible to I list. It's convertible to I collection. It's convertible. They're all.
But list of T extends collection of T, right?
And I read only collection of T.
But it doesn't. Types beat interfaces.
I
True,
don't think
but
it extends collection of T. We'll double check.
It extends I collection of T, not
Right.
or I list of T.
Yeah.
I thought list of T extended collection of T.
No,
No.
collection of T is an object model API, so it would only extend the interfaces. At which point you have this problem that it's
Fair
not
enough. So,
well defined.
So then we would need I read only collection, I collection, collection, and list.
But you can't expose those without causing ambiguities.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Why not?
If you have an
it won't-
overload if I have a foo that takes an I collection of T and a foo that takes an I read only collection of T, and any type implements both, like list of T,
Right.
the compiler will fail to compile.
Yes, unless we then also overload collection, which will catch all of the custom collection types, and list, which is the only collection that I can think of that is both of the interfaces but not a collection.
Yeah,
I don't think that's true.
Okay.
I mean, that might handle a lot of types, but not all of them, right? Immutable array comes to mind. Would probably not work. So there's I think it's just once you go down that path, I think it's just fragility, right?
Okay. I mean, this was like, can we get it with 8/8 of support?
Like dictionary implements both I collection and I read only collection.
Here's another one, yeah.
Yeah, fortunately, you never index into dictionary in the way that we're talking about, so that's okay.
That's true too, but I think the
But it is a good example, though. Yeah.
Dan just joined the wrong meeting. That was funny. All right, so then, as I said, like at least from my point of view, I think we should have a collection one. I think it's just trying to figure out what the API shape would be, and I don't want to hold the other ones hostage for this one.
Yeah. So if a way to solve it and put the call at the caller site would be, throw if invalid index T value comma T count, or sorry, value and count, and then that's just less than. And if we don't even make it T, we make it be int and or the system.index type, then I think now we've covered that, and everybody would say throw if invalid index value comma collection.length.
So even there you have issues like APIs that like insert APIs. They don't go from 0 to length -1. They go from 0 to length.
Yeah. I mean, all right. Yeah.
Maybe we need some more specialized APIs. So I guess it just goes back to, if somebody has a proposal for this, I think I'm happy to take it.
Fair enough.
But it does feel wrong.
To me, it's of all of these things, it is the most valuable. But I agree that it needs a little more thought.
Right.
There's one other issue not to discuss today, but with another round of throw helpers being proposed, I think we have kind of one more that's got 6 or 7 proposed in it. We could, if someone comes up with a good way of doing this, we could just lump it into that one to review those all together.
Yeah.
There was also a request on this issue for something for enums, but I don't have a good answer for enums other than cast and do it yourself.
Right. So yeah, the FDG does specifically warn people not to use enum as defined for a range check, because unless the enum lives in your same assembly, you don't actually know what is defined as checking.
Right.
And if we had the throw if not between or whatever, then you could pass the lower and upper bound of the enum, because enums are comparable, I think, and then
they're non-generically comparable, I believe.
So they're not comparable then?
I don't believe they're comparable of T.
Okay, you can less than them, but you can't comparable.
Yeah.
Well, if you're talking about like the compare to methods within the BCL, like they look at more than just comparable of T, right?
Well, but this is can you with a generic method have T be an enum and T be an enum without an enum constraint, and you understand that you can say less than or dot compare to. And if they don't virtually implement comparable the same way that array virtually implements list, then or ilist, then it wouldn't work. But
to be honest, I don't understand why people need the enum one, because usually when I write methods that take an enum, I end up having a switch statement anyway, and then I just say in the default case throw, sorry, I don't know what enum member you want me to, or what operation you want me to perform.
Right, and that's the right case for most people, because if someone extends an enum to include a value that you don't understand, like, you should probably fail.
Right.
Yeah, it should still be an out of range for your particular method.
It just seems weird to me to do this check once before and then do because you still have to write the default case anyway, right? So like it seems I'd rather have one failure case and not 2.
Indeed,
yeah, that's fair.
I mean, it would be if you have to do other work before you would call what the enum is dispatching into, and it's the wait, I could have avoided that work because of an exception, but that.
I mean, you usually don't optimize
it's marginal.
for this, right? I mean, usually you assume success until proven otherwise, right? I mean, like, because it's basically a fatal error in your programming, right? It's like, well, sorry, somebody extended the enum, so the program is not going to die.
Yep.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so
I've got a throw if not defined that I use for some of my code in my graphics engine repo, and it's primarily around interrupt scenarios where an invalid enum basically means native is going to throw and fail for this, and I want to provide a better exception or recovery case and not waste the time calling into doing the whole transition to native.
Right, but presumably you're doing it on an enum type that you own.
Oftentimes it's an interrupt enum, but yes, it's effectively one I own.
Right, and I mean the more OS or whatever library you're using forward version would really be you pass it in, and when it fails, then now you back ask the question of That's why enums are just hard to validate, because it's who should do the validation and where is always a hard question.
Right.
and there's also examples where APIs only accept a subset of values, right? So
yeah. So I don't think it's a thing that we should maybe ever make good and easy, because it's always you really kind of need to think about it.
Yeah, I'm fine with that, honestly. All right, so then maybe let's move on to the next one. Anybody context on this?
Jeremy K, is this why you're here? Looks like Jeremy might be muted or may have stepped away for a sec, but I assume this is why he's in the meeting for this issue.
I mean, I think it's like if there's a corresponding flag in Windows, I think it's a fine thing to add. Not sure if we want to keep the values as they are here.
I assume we're saying that this is just a pass through of Windows values.
Yeah,
I mean,
especially if the enum's backed by a ushort, like that typically means it's an interrupt value.
Yeah, I guess it is fundamentally a Windows module anyway, right? Because it's a DLL file.
It's a portable executable, yeah. Could be an X. It could be an exe. Doesn't have to be a DLL.
Sure.
But
we decided to effectively tie it to the Windows format, right? So that's why it is effectively a Windows format. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think the naming, I don't know what any of these values mean, but they seem fine as proposed.
Yeah, I agree with control flow guard instead of guard CF, and force integrity is force integrity. So it looks good to me.
Yeah.
And I think we can just approve this as an easy one.
Yeah, do it.
Hey, look, it was a quick review. We finally did what the meeting title says.
Yeah, I probably should.
Oh, Joe. Yeah, Joe, I see you in the meeting actually. Below the fold. Did you have any thoughts on this? It's part of your pod.
Yeah, I'm here. This is usually I actually just ping Steve Harder. He's usually the one that looks into this side of reflection. Yeah, honestly, I don't really have much context into this one. I don't know if you want me to still have him join. He'll probably join. But yeah, it looks like it's approved already.
Yeah, we just hit approve, so.
Okay.
You can tell him don't bother.
Okay, will do. Sorry about that.
Do you agree with what I just wrote down?
Yep.
As far as I can, as far as I can tell, this isn't actually changing any code. It's just basically providing defines for these things, because people could have checked them just by pulling the flags out manually, right?
Well, I don't know what we return right now if we don't have a corresponding value. It's possible we just return 0 for those, right? Or maybe we just...
I'm guessing this is we've mapped open a PE and like you can read the characteristics property, and instead of getting a pretty two string because we know what the named flags are, it's like
just get the flags directly.
Here's the number because there was an unmapped flag.
Yeah, we're literally reading a 16-bit integer straight from the PE and mapping it directly to an enum.
Well then.
So yeah, it would have worked already just without the nice consts.
Yeah.
Seems like we should just do it then. Yep. All right. Yeah. Easy enough. Base 64 is valid.
All right, so we previously approved this one. If you could scroll down, Jeremy or Emo, you can see the shape that we approved. But then subsequently, Levi followed up on a few loose ends from the discussion and highlighted that we have two APIs, the one that supports chars, convert.from base 64 string, and the one that supports bytes, base 64 .encode, decode, blah, 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 differ in their handling of whitespace. The former permits it, the latter does not, which makes base 64.is valid. That works for both chars or bytes. Confusing, to say the least, because it would have to provide a different answer for chars versus bytes, which we really don't want. So this discussion is to revisit this. I outlined, if you scroll down, I outlined a few options. Keep going. I have like a bulleted list. Yeah, there we go. Just the bottom of the screen.
Oh.
So there are a variety of things that we could do. My preference would be one of what's 4, 5, or 6 on the list. We could just make the existing decode, the byte-based decode, we can make it support whitespace. And then is valid obviously supports whitespace as well, and everything is consistent. We could make it configurable, so we could add some sort of new enum. We could allow base64 is valid to accept that enum. And then you get to choose, or we could have a Boolean property or whatever, a Boolean parameter, I mean. Or we could both do that and add new overloads to the decoding functions that also take such an option and make it configurable for both chars and bytes. And if we did that, we could then also choose whether we wanted to leave the default for base64 decode as it currently is or retcon it.
Is there any harm with allowing whitespace?
I think the harm would just be if someone really didn't want it and they were using this to get an exception, we'd be taking away their exception. I don't know when that would happen, but that would be the downside.
I mean, it seems to me like the only places where that would happen is you know, common wire formats, right? Somebody handcrafts an HTTP request message, right? And there's a header value, and they didn't, you know, remove the white space from it already, and so you get like additional white space. But then would you really want to throw? Would you just take the value as is? Like I have a hard time thinking of a case where I definitely don't want to allow white space. That seems fringe in nature.
So the case where you would not want to allow white space is if, as you mentioned, you're already in a context where the rules say you shouldn't have had white space. You did the I'm going to make a buffer that is 3/4 the length of the input, and then somebody has now confused you into putting some zeros at the end because the base64 decode didn't fill the buffer that you gave it. But presumably it returns how many bytes it wrote, and you should have checked that.
Oh, you're saying because I assume the entire input is base64, but because we implicitly trimmed it, my output buffer was over allocated.
Correct.
Yeah,
so you look at header.length. Header.length says it's 16, so you make a 9-byte destination. You call base64 decode, and it says it wrote 0 because it was entirely space.
Gotcha.
But you're like, I have 9 bytes now. It's like, yeah, they're all 0. Well, actually, they're all whatever they were. They're presumably all whatever they were. So now you have maybe a different problem.
If we did want a specific API that did not allow white space, we could call it is base64 strict or something. That could also solve the problem that we had identified earlier in the thread, where our base64 implementations kind of allow discarding non-zero bits at the end of the input.
Yeah.
So let's back up for a second. So base64, the type as we have it today, does not allow white space, correct?
Correct.
And so the problem is that you call base64 is valid, and later on you don't pass it to base64 dot something, but instead you pass it to convert to base64, and that fails.
Well,
sorry,
yeah,
that succeeds even though we said we won't. Is that the problem?
Yeah, or the other way around.
Yeah,
So-
either. I mean, if is valid says that white space is valid, then you pass it to base64.decode. It throws an exception. If base64 is valid says that white space is invalid, then you're throwing away valid input that convert.from base64 would have accepted.
But yeah, the latter part, I think the former makes sense why that's a problem, because then the type is no longer self-consistent, right? But it seems to me, at least at a high level, fine to say, well, base64 is valid, does not allow white space, because one of the methods you do, it just happens so that this other type over there, convert, happens to allow white space. Is that really a problem?
Well, ideally we'd support both bytes and chars. What we approved was is valid for both bytes and chars. The only method for decoding chars is convert from base64.
Oh, we don't have a base64 dot 4 chars, I see.
No, we could add one. I'd be fine to add one.
I mean, that might be the
probably
easier
should.
problem. Or the
Yes,
easier
and
solution.
then the type at least would be self-consistent. We'd say convert is just doing a different thing.
Yeah, convert happens to allow more than this type, which I think is fine.
I guess we need to understand whether it would be sufficient.
Right. So in my universe, which is PIM-based encoding, white space is not only allowed, it's quote unquote mandatory. That you're supposed to hit enter after 72 text characters.
Let me have a follow-up question real fast. What kind of white space is allowed / mandatory?
In between, it sounds like.
For PIM, it's both new line at the end of the thing, and then because it was supposed to be an email, it's like it's allowed to get space pre-pinned from hitting reply.
Is vertical tab allowed?
I don't remember.
Okay, because convert allows it.
Right. In the crypto code in our PIM encoding class, we use a subset of base 64 that is defined by the less stupid PIM spec.
Sorry, I should have said horizontal tab, not vertical tab, but regardless.
Yeah, whoever uses vertical tabs, I was about to ask. Like, that seems...
Vertical tab is the character that you put in if you really want to just make someone sad.
Yeah,
yeah, I don't even
so
know what it's supposed to do.
We have several definitions of white space within the BCL, and the convert.from base64 string method has its own definition of white space, separate from all of the rest of the BCL's definition.
Obviously.
So just throwing that out there.
In crypto PIM is defined by RFC 7468. It is the horizontal tab, the vertical tab, the form feed, space, carriage return, and line feed.
Okay, so a different set then would be honored by either convert or the space 64 type.
So how do we like ideally handle this? We basically just tell people like Jeremy, like, do it yourself, filter out the white space according to whatever spec you have, and then you just can't do a one-shot thing. You have to basically chunk it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, we have our own. So PIM encoding has its own version of this already, and that when we talked about this before, we were trying to unify it, and that's why it is valid out. What's the length that I determined? If we're going to say that this is not to be used for anything other than the base 64 type itself, and we're going for just consistency, then it doesn't need to support white space, and you can know the count because it's 3/4. And then I stick with my own because I'm implementing RFC 7468 and not the absolute minimum version of base 64.
If only we had an index of any values of T-type that we could use to specify ignorable whitespace characters when doing base 64 processing.
Oh God, don't make me sad.
I'm only half joking here.
I know.
So remember an hour ago when I said I couldn't think of any other APIs that would be used with?
Yeah.
Like if we actually do have a bunch of different places within .NET that for whatever reason have to support whitespace, but they all have to support different kinds of whitespace, like
I mean, that was what I was
those
saying.
callers provide the set is not the end of the world.
Sounds like the problem that we also have with paths, right? Invalid characters comes to mind here.
I mean, an interesting differentiation between that, so if we actively want to think back to the index of any type, is presumably the current index of any is going to throw if you give it nothing. I mean, it could also just know that it's going to be fine. No, -1 is always the answer. But in the white space here, none is a valid option. So it's almost the same thing. I mean, granted, it could take a nullable index of any, and null means no white space.
Right. But I mean, at this point, I mean, like ignoring the more advanced thing, are we overthinking this? Do we need a generic base 64 reader writer where you can chunk it yourself and then get the final value out? Or do we really want the one-stop API effectively, or one-shot API that takes a complicated input to describe excludable whitespace?
So we do have operation status-based APIs, which will go as far as they can, but they won't necessarily stop at white space. For example, if you, in normal base64, like if you want to encode a small amount of data, you might have, A equals, for instance. But if you see, A space, B space, C, where does it actually stop? Presumably it actually stops before the A because it couldn't make any progress on the A itself.
The problem with base64 is it doesn't say that you have to get 4 letter groups chunked in the same place. So
yeah,
you can't just say it'll chunk decode until it hits a white space and then you get to skip past it, because you need to basically remove all on whatever white space you're allowing.
right. So when the operation status-based API returns to you, like you might actually have to skip forward a few elements in order to see what white space has to be removed before you can continue.
If it was only going to pull in a contiguous 4 characters at a time, then you'd have to then buffer any that you found that were not white space yourself into your own. Great, I have
a stateful reader would.
full.
Yeah, a stateful reader, as Emo suggested, would actually solve this, but it's stateful. Granted, stateful could just be 32 bits on the stack.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a ref struct if you really wanted to follow the JSON thing here, right? But
it doesn't even have to be a ref struct. It could just be a regular struct, but yeah.
Well, yeah, if it's status, it's shitty when you copy it though accidentally, but yeah.
I mean, it would literally be an int, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
Because we actually had a UTF-8, stateful UTF-8 decoder in the dead UTF-8 string project, and its reader was literally a struct that had a single backend field of type uint. So okay, if you make copies of it, whatever.
Right. So then, like, what was the scenario for base64 is valid again? It's basically just some high-level API wants to throw early.
Yeah, you read something at startup from configuration, but you don't actually care about using the data until later.
Yeah, I think in that case, like, basically the scenario is still kind of, it's acceptable when the APIs accept more, but it's not acceptable if the APIs accept less, right? So in that sense, if is valid does not support white space, that would be consistent with that statement, but it would be unfortunate, I guess.
I mean, it's depending on the situation, it might be unusable.
Well, if you literally read from config, then you can just say just don't have white space in your config.
That's not always tractable.
I mean, so like, if this doesn't support white space, PIM encoding can't use it, and that's fine. It's just if we're hoping for we get to add a thing and remove a thing, so it's basically net negative. That isn't true.
I mean, that's my goal with a lot of these things is if we can't use it ourselves, because the one place that we have a need for it internally, we can't use it, then have we really designed the right thing?
Right.
And
that's fair.
If we're designing something, we should be designing it to unify, so we don't have X number of copies out there. I don't know.
It sounds like PEM encoding can't use it anyway, even if it does support white space, unless you can somehow customize the white space it does understand, right?
Assuming that we wrote the white space check correctly, and it only allows the 5 characters that I rattled off there instead of calling char.is as white space, then yes. But I'm looking at the RFC, not at the code.
Yeah.
I just know that what we have is basically in PIM encoding, we have a private thing that is essentially base64 is valid, and it also omits the count, because while asking have I found valid characters, it's counting them, and that's because in PIM encoding, it's only a PIM encoding if we see the PIM header followed by legal base64 followed by a PIM footer, and anything that is not that just gets skipped. So we need to know the answer, is this valid, distinct from what does it decode to. And in fact, since all we return is the ranges of we found base64 data between here and here, we never even decode it.
So there's a comment in PEM encoding.is white space character. / match white space characters from convert.base64.
Right. Again, and so we may have expanded it to be anything that would take, because that was
So
our previous.
it's the same
test.
for white space, space tab new line feed that convert dot from base 64 or whatever it is accepts.
Oh, do we not accept the vertical tab? We don't. Ha! Suck it, vertical tab.
Wait, does the RFC require you to understand vertical tab?
I think so.
Oh, well, congratulations, you found a bug.
Won't fix.
Have fun fixing it.
Yeah.
Because if I say yes, it's a valid PIM encoding. Good luck. It's B and C.
So then,
Yep. Vertical tab is definitely in the BNF. Presumably we kicked it out because we couldn't decode them. But yes, I agree with Nick Craver. Vertical tab was banned by the Geneva Conventions.
especially in
so-
UI.
Of my opinion, what I shared was, I like 4, which is make base 64 decode support white space. If the other option that we want to go is remove the char overload or add a base 64 or add a char based overload on the base 64 type that does not allow white space, and we're just saying that this type is consistent with itself and it doesn't know that convert exists, those are fine with me. But once we're allowing white space, then I think it needs to also produce the count, which is the shape we approved before. If we're going to say it doesn't allow white space, it doesn't need to produce the count, because that's just easy math at that point.
Yeah, I think my ideal, I think what I would like us to do, but I could be talked off this, is we do what Jeremy just said. We do option 4. We add the is valid methods that accept the 4 characters of white space that convert from base 64 does, and we change decode to do the same. And if that proves problematic in any way, shape, or form, we accept it as a breaking change and we add a new decode that is strict. I think Levi had suggested that before.
Yeah, because then you could also check edge cases that we don't currently handle correctly today.
Yeah, I mean, like the cost of 4, just to be very transparent, is perf. Allowing white space will be slower.
Only if it shouldn't be measurably slower unless you encounter white space.
That's fair.
And then checking for the white space is faster than throwing an exception.
I guess in that sense, it's definitely faster than before. Yeah.
I assume it'll still show up in the perf hit because the body will be bigger, but you're right. It should be a small change for existing conforming inputs.
I would at least hope so. We should be able to make that the case.
Yeah, I mean, it could certainly do I'm going to run until I hit white space and then fall into the great, now I'm going to start compacting buffers.
Right. I mean, if we change nothing other than the place where it currently throws an exception, we jump to a quote slow path. Right. It really shouldn't affect anything prior to that point.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so we're gonna say base 64 decode gets upgraded to support the 4 characters of white space that .NET has agreed are valid in base 64.
And then we could add a decode strict later if it proves necessary, and we could add an overload of base 64 decode for chars if we want to.
Would we ever expand the set of allowed white space in the future?
If we did, then that would be option 5 and whether it's an enum for what do we do, or it's literally we take the index of any chars type as a character set, which is different than a character set.
Well, the reason I ask is because if you do plan on allowing non-ASCII whitespace in the future, then you need to somehow say, like, this method that takes a ROS byte is specifically interpreting the ROS byte as Latin 1, UTF-8, something else.
That's true. Did we name that parameter?
I think it's base64.decode calls the parameter UTF-8.
Yeah.
Actually, the method is called decode from UTF-8. It's not called decode. So
and the parameter is called UTF-8.
Right. But like we put UTF-8 in the name, so it would not be extended ASCII.
Right. I mean the is valid method.
Oh, that's fair. That is valid. Yeah, we'd have to.
I mean, I think Levi had proposed maybe like base64 UTF-8 text, or we could just call the char1, I don't know, text and the UTF-8 UTF-8 text, or I don't know.
Or we just document and say, like, it's UTF-8, sorry, like, and you have to read the documentation to know this.
I mean, so the version that we have that is here is only going to be those 4 characters.
Yes, but the discussion we're having today is literally all about expanding this API to interpret stuff it doesn't currently interpret.
But that would be that would be like, so we could call it now ahead of time base64 UTF-8 text if we wanted, or base64 text UTF-8. We can slap the UTF-8 in the parameter name. I'm just saying when we add whatever the option is, then we could clarify by bytes we only mean UTF-8, or by bytes we only mean ASCII 7 or whatever. Like this overload, it doesn't matter which interpretation it is because they're the same. It's only future overloads that then have to resolve the ambiguity.
So you're saying that this overload, you're making a statement now that this overload will never, ever, ever, for the remainder of the known universe, understand whitespace other than the 4 characters we just talked about?
I think I'm making that claim.
Even though currently we are talking about a breaking change to this exact type to make it understand values it doesn't currently know about.
Fine, stick UTF-8 in the parameter name somewhere.
I mean, you can see this, discrepancy here.
Yes, this goes back to I really wish we had char 8 just as a signifier. But I lost that battle.
So
I lost it too.
So stick it in the method name or stick it in the parameter name, and I guess we're okay. And that way it's future proof.
You wanted there. Who wants infix and who wants suffix?
For parameter names?
Base64 UTF-8 text or base64 text UTF-8 on the ROS byte overload.
Yeah, that's what I meant for the parameter name, right? You don't want to change the method name, right? I think on the parameter name, I don't care because it's, nobody really calls them by name.
I'd probably suffix if no one else has a strong opinion, because we tend to do suffixes on method names.
All right, the suffix is win. At 1 vote to 0.
1 to 0. 1 to meh.
So what is the name then of the parameter? Base64?
Text UTF-8.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Nick in chat that
Beautiful.
Base64 UTF-8 text sounds more Englishy, but I also agree that it's more often a suffix. So I decided I was exactly torn.
Yeah.
Okay, so then
approved again.
So we have 20 minutes left. I think we have a better chance of the last finishing the last tab on your list than the second to last. So let's do
Works.
that. Yeah.
Approve.
Excellent. Done.
I was about to say, I mean,
So there's only one thing that I'll ask right now, and it isn't relevant because I guess we could also lift the XX hash 128 into the same 20 minutes. Is do we want to add, if we add XX hash 128, do we want to add hash to int 128? Because if so, that requires splitting the ref for the first time.
Yeah, we would have to if definitely, yes.
I just went to the bottom of the proposal.
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's
It's like the second to last message or
yeah,
something.
right there.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
So since int 128 is not net standard 2.0, but this assembly is, it would mean that we'd have to split the ref. And
Yes.
we can, it's just a maintenance problem. So I'm okay with it. Just I think this is the only one that's really intentional. I mean, sure, we should talk about like the method name on the rest of them, but this one I think we need to make a very intentional decision because it's the do we split the ref or not.
So two things. One, I presume that get current hashes int 64 should return int 6 or should return long, and
Yeah,
they're all
that's a typo.
returning int.
Yeah.
But so you could have this return a tuple tuple lower upper, in which case it is then trivial to construct an int 128 on newer assemblies, and you wouldn't have to split the ref just as an option. We have the lower upper pattern for the tuples in math for big mole. We've got a similar pattern for divrem with the quotient remainder. We've got it in a few places.
Does
So-
int 128 take a lower and upper in its
Yep.
constructor? Okay.
Yep.
So
It
I should-
explicitly takes it upper lower though, so that users could write out the hex bytes as if they were writing out a literal.
So Tanner, one of the things that you're not seeing in this proposal is all of these APIs already have methods which write out the value to a span a byte. So they'll write it out to a 4-element span a byte or an 8-element or a 16-element span a byte, and
Okay.
you could easily turn those into whatever integer you want.
Right. Because the non-cryptographic, I guess, yeah. So to go back to the top, and we'll get to the bottom one when we get to the bottom one. So non-cryptographic hash algorithm, when we built it, we talked about the fact that we only had 32 and 64-bit things, and when we designed it, we were very intentional. These algorithms produce bytes. They don't produce numbers, and that's what we went with. And I'm very opinionated about that. Levi is very opinionated about that. Morgan was very opinionated about that. And everyone who's not us, plus I'll assume Kevin's on our side because he usually is, everyone except the 4 of us thinks we did it wrong. And they want numbers. And so this is saying, fine, if everyone wants numbers, we're going to give you numbers so that you don't. What everyone seems to be doing is doing machine Indian, of they just pass in the pointer to where they want it to write in the int that they have, and then they're not realizing that's going to screw them up when they get on a big Indian machine. And so this is, we will give you an API that says you will always get the same number, and if you want it as bytes, you can get the bytes. If you want it as the number, you can get the number, but only for the. Oh no, you added it as the instance method too. Oh, you caught that. How dare you?
Yes.
Yeah, certainly the base class can't help you with that, but any of the sealed derived types can say, I know I'm 32-bit, I can give you an int 32. And I know the relation, I know what I want the relationship between bytes and the int to be. So we have the static method hash. So then this is the static method hash 2, and then whatever the type name it's going to give back is. And then the instance method is get current hash, and then so get current hash as whatever the type is.
Yeah, and we would document the relationship between this integer that you're getting back and the bytes that would have been written out to the destination buffer.
Right. So the 5 of us that are, or 4, I can count, that are disagreeing with the rest of the universe, say that these will all be documented as how they're interpreting the bytes, even though the implementation of probably every single one of these is going to be that the bytes are how we're interpreting the int. Or by int, I mean whatever numeric data type it is. So we're going to stand on principles, and the docs are going to match our principles, and people are going to call the numeric ones because that's what they really want.
Long story short, everyone should be happy.
I do have a question about the shape. In particular, naming a side, should we be using signed or unsigned data types?
So the general rule that we have is don't use unsigned types except their byte, or except byte. Yeah. Because they all have the T in the name, we can give everyone their cake and have both. But if we're only going to have one, the .NET way is to be the signed types.
And then just have a caller cast.
Yeah.
If they care.
I hate casting.
Yeah.
The primary reason I ask is all of the implementations, as far as I'm aware, are unsigned, and we end up with an unsigned number, and then in order to match this API, we cast.
Hey, Emo, when you ran across this in your code yesterday, were you signed or unsigned?
So it's funny you asked, because I actually didn't care. I just wanted a type that is easy to effectively store and write to other things. So I didn't want an allocation for a byte array, right? So I just, like for me, I just got a long out of it, and I think I also did a little Indian because I didn't actually care. So I messed up the value.
We have all these things like stack alloc nowadays, and people are still saying that allocations are a problem.
No, I mean, that's what I do,
I think
right?
he's storing it to a database, so he needed to.
So I don't want to have a shit ton of byte arrays floating around, right? So like, but spans are not useful to actually pass around. So you need something you can actually hold on to, right? Which in my case is just the long, right?
Oh, so you'll let the database later turn it into an 8-byte array for you. Okay.
Well, I mean, in my case, the database is an actual file I write to disk, so it's
Sure.
But yes.
int.parse. Yeah, but I'm guessing then that you wrote long and not you long.
I wrote long, and I also got it. I think I originally got it back with a little endian, but then when I was reading the docs, it turned out that it's written in big endian, so I wrote it back in big endian.
Yeah, I think CRC32 is little endian because it was designed by networking people.
Yeah,
but
I think
networking is big Indian.
So let me devil's advocate why we might want this to be unsigned.
The TCP buffer people were little endian.
So remember when we switched from NLS to ICU, we had a whole bunch of issues with like, oh, in certain cultures, the negative sign is a simple hyphen, but in, Sweden, the negative sign is, an M dash or something, or a special negative character. I'm wondering if it's possible, if people are really using this for persistence, and then they're saving it on one machine, reading it on another machine, and they're just doing something really simple like int.parse, which, by the way, is culture aware by default, if we could end up in situations where data gets misinterpreted on the destination machine because of the presence of the negative sign.
I mean, that's a
good point. So to restate that, you think the textual version of the integral response will be what they use for persistence instead of the bytes.
Correct.
And that our default toString of signed integers is essentially invariant. So the parsing of that would also be invariant.
For unsigned integers, yes. Tarek would know more about this. I just remember this being a huge pain point over the past few years. And I don't know if we've addressed all the different places where it occurs. He would definitely be the expert on this.
I mean, I think you're right from the point of view, because in my case, I also write them to a text format, which I think is either XML or JSON, I can't remember. And just for aesthetic reasons, I don't think I want negative IDs. I would probably always cast it as a ulong and write that out.
Fair enough. So Steve's saying all the places he found that people did it were using unsigned types.
Well, in particular, I'm saying that the implementations themselves are all based in unsigned types.
Yeah, because they're all just bits, right? Like the sign is literally just a bit.
This really seems similar to the whole case of the bit converter exposed double to int 64 bits. And because int 64 is signed and that's what .NET uses, but literally no one who's using that API wanted signed. They all wanted unsigned because you immediately have to do bit manipulation or serialization or visualization of the data. And so you don't want to see the signed anything. And so now we've got 2 int 32 and 2 uint 32. And then 2 int 64 and 2 uint 64. We've got both pairs for all of the floating point APIs now.
Fair enough.
So then,
So,
for those, would we offer
I-
both, or do we just offer the unsigned one? I mean, it seems like we will only do the unsigned one, right?
So
would be my
certainly when we get down to the 128, which is a type that doesn't exist yet, but when we get down to that one, if we're going to go with we will return the tuple of lower and upper, it's certainly more convenient if we say unsigned, because then they're both unsigned instead of upper is signed and lower is unsigned. Which how I assume we would do int 128 if we split it into 2 int 64s.
Yeah, the constructor takes 2 unsigned inputs.
So yeah, if we want consistency, slap a U everywhere.
And then the seed is still
for
signed,
whoever.
correct? Because that's what the current APIs do, right?
Correct.
Sorry, what is signed?
The seed.
Oh, the seed.
Which
Yes.
is-
I would probably want to be consistent with the current.
yeah.
Even though it's a little weird, but yeah.
Yeah, it does seem a bit weird, but
So does the original version to unsigned types in .NET 1.0.
yeah. When we have a
So
time
only-
machine, I'll fix that part. So then for the XX
So-
hash 128, are we saying we are doing it, or are we saying we're postponing that?
Well, so I think we can talk about everything up to there here. So is everybody good with the name hash to uint 64, etc.? Does anybody have objections?
Well, I would say it better starts with hash because that's our one-shot API right now. So
Right.
it seems you want this as a suffix of that.
Yep. All right. So before hitting approve on this, change to your next tab, which I think is.
This one.
Oh,
No.
I thought you had preemptively pulled up the. So he has the link there. This is just what we did for XX hash 3, except instead of 3, it says 128. And the seed is long if it wasn't already. I think it already was on 3 because it's 64-bit based.
Yeah, it's 64-bit.
And I didn't actually look at the implementation. It doesn't take a 128 seed. It's still a 64 seed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm cool with this because it's just XS hash 3 and then S/3/128.
Yeah, I think we basically said it in the last time we reviewed it that if we wanted to add it, we would just add it. So this is it.
Yep, sounds good to me. And then
We add this and then pop back and then ask, do we want to do uint 128 or do we want to do a tuple of uint 64s?
so remind me, why would we do the tuple thing rather than giving you the int 128?
So the question is, what is this type going to do if you're net standard 2.0? Because the library is net standard 2.0. Is it going to not have these methods? Is it going to have a different version of these methods?
Well, it has.
what?
Yeah, I mean, you can get the hash out, right? Just how you would always done it, right? So you just get back effectively a byte array,
Right.
or you just do it to a span, do whatever you want.
Right, but if there's is it convenient for someone to do? Because if we're adding these for convenience, then it's net standard 2.0 loses out on the convenience. And then there's the convenience for us of right now, we can use the ref.cs generator. And the moment we have a method that doesn't exist in net standard 2.0, now we have to do less natural things.
I mean,
we're adults. We can deal.
I would say if you're net standard 2, I think I'm not convinced that giving you two ulongs is necessarily making things better, because the whole point of this API is to get you back a single value you can basically store around. But in a tuple, while technically a single value is probably not the thing you want anywhere, so you would have to do something else. And since you don't have 128, well, you probably have some custom representation, and then I don't know whether 2 ulongs are actually super helpful for that representation, right? And then at that point you can argue, well, you do whatever custom thing you have to do to get back the span, which, it's 3 lines of code, right? It's not like, oh my God, I have to write a lot of stuff for that, right? So I mean, to me, like the one-stop shop API here to get a single value makes sense when we actually have a representation. If you don't have one, well, then you don't get to call the method. I think that seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, that sounds fun.
And,
yes, I agree with Steve. We're adults, we can handle it.
And so basically we were saying, okay, XXS hash 128, the entire thing doesn't exist for net standard 2, or the entire thing will, just these 2 methods won't?
These 2 methods won't.
Okay.
Yeah. The type we can add easily because it's only based on bytes. But as of this change of if your hash size is naturally aligned to a numeric type, that we will give you the numeric type.
Yeah.
And if you say aren't all hashes aligned to numeric types, SHA-1 is 160 bits. Granted,
Right.
It's not a non-cryptographic hash algorithm.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
But yeah, when we designed this, really the thing we were doing is getting people off of SHA-1 they were using it for the wrong reason. And so the input case we had was you already had bytes, and now we're giving you different bytes. But many of our callers since then seem to want numbers, so we'll give them numbers.
Okay, so then...
Happy, Steve?
Extremely.
And then I guess we can approve this one here as well. Or we already did? Okay. Never mind.
Are you going to review the PR on that one, Steve? So I don't have to read all that vector code again?
Yeah, I need to take the time to go through and compare it to the standard implementation or the reference implementation.
Then you get to try both sides, the transliterating and then the reading transliterated.
Mm-hmm. The nice thing is a lot of it is just
6 hours.
A lot of XXHash 128 shares its implementation with XXHash 3. So
Cheater.
Yeah. But I get to validate that the code that was moved out of one CS file into another CS file actually moved as is.
All right.
I don't think we're going to be able to finish this in 4 minutes.
That was my
I'm happy
question.
to take more time, but I also want to be respectful of people's time.
Yeah, then let's maybe not do that. Like if you think it's taking 20 minutes, then I'd rather call it a day.
Let's call it a day.
Good. All right, then thanks everyone. This was fun. I hope you go back to .NET Conf now.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.